A lone rancher spent all his money for a mail-order bride. But a widow with 5 kids stepped off the wagon. The dust of the road was the same color as his thoughts. A fine gray powder that settled on everything and promised nothing. Silas stood by his wagon, the wood weathered to silver. His hands knotted on the reins of the single, tired horse. He had watched the horizon for 2 hours, a rigid figure against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the plains. The sun was a pale wafer in the slate sky, offering light but no warmth. He felt the biting wind slice through his worn coat, a familiar sting that mirrored the coldness coiled deep inside him. For 5 years, since he'd buried Sarah and the baby that never was, that cold had been his only constant companion. It was a silence so profound it had its own sound, a low hum of absence that filled his small cabin, his empty barn, his hollowed-out heart. The money, every last dollar saved from trapping and selling what little his harsh land would yield, was gone. Sent east in a hopeful, desperate letter. A simple request for a wife, a companion, someone to share the silence, to make it less of a predator. He didn't expect love, not anymore. He just wanted the sound of another person breathing in the dark. The stagecoach was a distant, creeping insect, growing slowly larger until it resolved into a shuddering box of wood and leather. It groaned to a halt, the horses steaming in the frosty air. The driver, a man with a face like a dried apple, grunted a greeting. Silas just nodded, his eyes fixed on the coach door. He had imagined this moment. A woman, plain perhaps, and certainly weary from the journey, but whole. Someone to stand beside him. The door creaked open. A woman emerged, and for a fleeting second his breath caught. She was not what the agency had described. Her face was thin, her eyes holding a deep, exhausted alertness that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. She carried a quiet dignity like a shawl wrapped tight against the cold, but she was worn down to the bone. Then another figure appeared behind her, a small boy of about 10, his face a miniature mask of his mother's caution. He held the hand of a younger girl, whose worn shoes barely seemed to hold together. Then another child, a girl with wide, frightened eyes, and another, a boy clutching a tattered blanket. And finally, cradled in the woman's arms, a baby, bundled against the wind. 5 of them. The driver cleared his throat, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Her name's Alara," he said, avoiding Silas's gaze. "Papers said she was headed for the Oak Haven settlement. This is as close as the route gets. Her husband took ill on the trail, he left the rest unsaid." Silas stared, his mind a frozen river. This was not a bride. This was a catastrophe. A widow and 5 children. His money, his one desperate gamble for a sliver of life, had bought him a portrait of utter destitution. The woman, Alara, did not speak. She simply gathered her children closer, her body a frail fortress against his silent, stony judgment. The oldest boy's eyes were defiant. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. A home he would have to build not with wood and nails, but with a courage he thought he'd long since buried. He felt the gazes of the few onlookers from the trading post, their curiosity sharp and mocking. He could turn away. He could tell the driver there was a mistake, send them back on the next stage, back to whatever hell they had fled. It was the sensible thing to do. But then he looked at the woman's hands, raw and chapped, clutching the baby. He saw the flicker of a memory. Sarah's hands, just as worn, just as gentle. The cold inside him shifted, a painful cracking of ice. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the immense silence. He gave a short, jerky nod toward his wagon. His voice, when it came, was a rusty hinge. "Get in." Alara flinched at the sound of his voice, a low rasp that seemed scraped from the very dirt beneath their feet. For a moment, she remained rigid, her children like small statues clustered around her. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. Every act of kindness she had encountered since her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to the fever had come with a hidden, brutal price. She looked from the man's weathered face, his eyes the color of a winter sky, to the bleak horizon that stretched behind him. There was nowhere else to go. Sending them back was a death sentence, a slow slide into starvation or worse. The stagecoach driver was already unloading her single, battered trunk. Its leather straps cracked and frayed. He heaved it onto the back of the wagon with a grunt of finality. The decision had been made for her. She nodded once, a small, dignified dip of her head, and began to herd her children toward the wagon bed. The oldest, Caleb, helped his sister Martha, then little Samuel. She lifted the youngest girl, Leah, onto the rough planks before climbing up herself, settling the baby, Daniel, more comfortably in her arms. She did not look at the silent man as he untied his horse and climbed onto the driver's seat. She simply stared straight ahead, her back as straight as a fence post, her heart a tight, cold knot of fear. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels creaking a mournful rhythm in the dust. The journey to his homestead was made in that same profound silence. The landscape was a study in desolation, the earth cracked and barren, the grasses bleached a pale, lifeless yellow. A distant howl echoed on the wind, a lonely sound that found an answer in the emptiness of her own soul. The man, Silas, never looked back. He drove the horse with a steady, unobtrusive hand, his shoulders a bulwark against the wind. He seemed a part of the land itself, hard, quiet, and enduring. Alara watched the back of his head, the way the muscles in his neck were taut with a tension she recognized. This was a man acquainted with grief. It clung to him like the dust on his coat. She pulled her children closer, the warmth of their small bodies a fragile defense against the growing chill of the evening. They arrived at a homestead that was little more than a scar on the vast plain. A small, sturdy cabin stood against the encroaching dusk, a thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A barn, its wood gray and tired, leaned slightly as if exhausted by the constant wind. There was a well, a small fenced-in patch of dirt that might be a garden in a kinder season, and nothing else for miles. Utter isolation. He brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin door. For a long moment he just sat there, the reins loose in his hands. She could feel his hesitation, a heavy weight in the air. He was regretting his impulsive act of charity. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to tighten. He finally dismounted, his boots making a soft thud in the dust. He didn't look at her. He looked at the cabin, then at the barn. "You and the children," he said, his voice still rough. "Take the house," he gestured with his chin. "There's wood by the stove, some flour and bacon inside." He turned and began unhitching the horse without another word, his movements deliberate and economical. He was putting a wall between them, a physical distance to match the emotional one. He would sleep in the barn. They were his burden, but he would not let them inside his life, only inside his shelter. Alara understood. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would accept the terms of this silent, brittle arrangement. She began to get her children down from the wagon, their limbs stiff with cold. "I ain't saying nothin'," she whispered to Caleb, her voice trembling slightly. "Just don't send me back," he nodded, his young face grim. He understood the precarity of their situation. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. It was a man's space, devoid of any softness. She saw him carry her trunk to the porch and leave it there before leading the horse toward the barn. The wooden door of the barn closed with a solid thud. He was gone. She was alone with her children in a stranger's house, in the middle of a vast and terrifying wilderness. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of wood smoke and dust, and began the work of survival. She would make this place a home, for a night or a lifetime. She would endure. The days settled into a quiet, unyielding routine, a silent dance of 2 solitary lives orbiting each other at a careful distance. Silas rose before the sun, the creak of the barn door the first sound to break the pre-dawn stillness. He would milk the single cow, his hands moving with an old, familiar rhythm, the warm steam rising in the frosty air. He would leave the pail of milk on the porch of the cabin, a silent offering, before taking his rifle and disappearing into the gray expanse of the plains, checking his trap lines. He moved through the world as if trying to leave no trace, his footsteps soft in the dust, his presence as unobtrusive as the wind. He ate his meals in the barn, hardtack and jerky, washed down with water from the well. He never approached the cabin when he knew she was awake. He was a ghost on his own land, a protector who kept his distance, and the space between the barn and the house felt as wide and impassable as a canyon. Elara, in turn, respected the invisible boundaries he had drawn. She and the children lived within the four walls of the cabin as if on a small, isolated island. Her days were a blur of mending worn-out clothes, stretching their meager rations, and trying to create a semblance of normalcy for her children. She taught Caleb his letters, using a piece of charcoal on the back of a shovel. She told the younger ones stories in a hushed voice, tales of green places and full larders that felt like fairy tales in this dusty, windswept land. The silence of the cabin was different from the silence of the man. Hers was filled with the soft breathing of her children, the gentle hum of a lullaby, the scratch of a needle through cloth. His was an emptiness, a void. She could feel it emanating from the barn, a cold and heavy sorrow. The children learned the rhythm of this new life quickly. They learned to play quietly, their laughter a rare and precious sound that seemed to quickly get swallowed by the vastness of the sky. They watched the man from the cabin window, a remote and powerful figure who provided for them without ever speaking a word. To them, he was not a man, but a force of nature, like the wind or the sun. One afternoon, Martha's last pair of shoes finally gave out, the sole flapping uselessly. Elara's heart sank. Winter was coming, its teeth already sharp in the morning air. She had no leather, no tools to fix it. She set the broken shoes by the door, a small monument to their poverty, and tried not to let the children see the despair in her eyes. That night, a storm blew in, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, rattling the single window of the cabin. She lay awake, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of her children, a profound sense of vulnerability washing over her. She was so utterly alone, a ship without a rudder, adrift in a merciless sea. The next morning, the wind had died down, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and cold. When she opened the door to fetch the pail of milk, she froze. Sitting beside the pail were Martha's shoes. The sole had been carefully stitched back on with thick, sturdy thread. A small piece of leather, cut from what looked like an old saddlebag, had been expertly patched over the worn-out toe. It was a rough but solid repair. Her gaze shot to the barn. The door was slightly ajar. She knew, with absolute certainty, that he had taken them in the night, worked on them by the light of a smoky lamp, and returned them before dawn. He had seen their need and met it without a word, without expecting thanks. It was a small gesture, an act of secret intervention, but it landed in her heart like a warm stone. He was watching. He was seeing them not just as a burden, but as people with needs, with worn-out shoes and cold feet. She picked up the shoes, the leather still cool from the night air, and for the first time in a very long time, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl within her. She called Martha over and helped her put them on. The fit was perfect. The girl's face lit up with a small, grateful smile. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. He had seen the shoes, and in them he had seen his own failure. He had provided shelter, but he had not provided care. He had kept his distance, nursing his own raw grief while a family shivered just 100 feet away. The memory of Sarah's face, pale and tired in her last days, rose before him. He had failed to save her. He would not fail these people, too. His secret acts of kindness continued, small ripples in the vast ocean of their silence. A brace of rabbits would appear on the porch, skinned and ready for the pot. A sack of potatoes, unearthed from a hidden root cellar he'd dug years ago, was left by the cabin door one morning. He never acknowledged these gifts. They were simply there, like offerings left for unseen spirits. Elara accepted them with a quiet, growing sense of wonder. She began to leave things for him in return. A loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm from the stove, placed on the well cover where she knew he would find it. A jar of wild berry preserves, painstakingly gathered and cooked down. It was a conversation without words, a barter of care and respect across the divide. She was paying her way, showing him she was not a beggar, but a partner in this strange, silent arrangement. The children, too, began to see him differently. He was no longer a frightening shadow. Caleb, the oldest, started watching him work from a distance, studying the way he mended a fence or sharpened an axe. He saw the deliberate, efficient way Silas moved, the deep competence in his hands. There was a reliability in the man that the boy found himself admiring. One day, Silas was attempting to reshoe his horse, a stubborn task for one man. The horse was skittish and the hoof was heavy. He struggled, his breath coming in frustrated clouds in the cold air. Caleb, after a moment of intense hesitation, walked slowly out of the cabin and across the dusty yard toward the barn. He stopped a respectful distance away. Silas froze, his hand on the horse's leg, and looked at the boy. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. "I can help," the boy said, his voice small but clear. "My pa. He taught me how to gentle a horse." Silas stared at him for a long beat. The silence stretched, taut and thin. He had not spoken to any of them directly since their arrival. He had kept them at arm's length, a buffer against the pain of memory. But the boy's offer was honest, his gaze direct. To refuse would be an act of cruelty. Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Hold his head," he grunted. "Speak soft to him." Caleb stepped forward, his movements calm and sure, and began to murmur to the horse, stroking its neck. The animal visibly relaxed, its ears softening. Silas went back to his work, and with the boy's help, the job was done in minutes. When they were finished, Silas straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Caleb, truly looked at him for the first time. He saw not just a child, but a capable young man, with his father's teachings still alive in him. "You've a good hand with him," Silas said. It was the most he had spoken at one time in 5 years. Caleb ducked his head, a flush of pride on his cheeks. "Thank you, sir." From that day on, a subtle shift occurred. The wall between the house and the barn began to crumble, stone by silent stone. Caleb would often follow Silas, helping with small chores, learning by watching. Silas, in turn, found himself speaking more, offering quiet instructions, a word of praise. He was teaching the boy, and in doing so, he was teaching himself how to connect again. He began to see the children not as a collective burden, but as individuals. Martha, quiet and observant. Samuel, full of a boisterous energy he was always trying to contain. Leah, with her wide, curious eyes. And the baby, Daniel, a small bundle of pure, uncomplicated life. He found himself leaving a carved wooden bird on the porch for Leah, or an interesting rock he'd found for Samuel. He didn't know why. The gestures were impulsive, rising from a place in him he thought had long since turned to dust. The harshness of his solitude was being eroded, softened by the steady, quiet presence of this family he had accidentally acquired. He was still a man wrapped in grief, but the shroud was beginning to feel a little less suffocating. The sounds from the cabin, a child's laugh, a woman's soft singing, were no longer intrusions. They were becoming the sounds of a life he had forgotten could exist. The first real snow came without warning, a thick, white blanket that descended overnight and buried the world in silence. It was beautiful and terrifying. The homestead was cut off, an island in a sea of white. For 2 days, the storm raged, the wind a physical force that battered the small cabin. Inside, Alara kept the fire roaring, the small space filled with a cozy warmth that defied the blizzard outside. They were safe. They were together. But on the 3rd morning, she woke to a frightening sound. Samuel was coughing, a dry, ragged bark that tore from his small chest. His forehead was burning with fever. Alara's blood ran cold. She knew this cough. It was the croup, the same sickness that had taken her younger brother when she was a girl. Out here, with no doctor and no medicine, it could be a death sentence. Panic? cold and sharp, seized her. She tried every remedy she knew. A steam from a kettle, a honey and onion syrup, but the boy's breathing only grew more labored, each breath a painful, whistling struggle. By evening he was gasping for air. Desperate, she did the one thing she had avoided since her arrival. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a shawl around her head, and plunged into the deep snow, fighting her way toward the barn. The cold was shocking, the wind stealing the air from her lungs. She pounded on the heavy wooden door, her knuckles raw. "Please!" she cried, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Please help me." The door swung open. Silas stood there, silhouetted by the dim light of a lantern, his face a mask of concern. He had heard the boys coughing, a sound that cut through the howl of the storm and straight into his heart. He saw the terror in her eyes, the glistening tears on her frozen cheeks. He didn't need an explanation. He grabbed his heaviest coat and followed her back to the cabin, pushing through the deep drifts. The moment he stepped inside, the warmth and the smell of family, of baking bread and wood smoke and life, hit him like a physical blow. It was the home he had lost, resurrected in this small, crowded room. He went to Samuel's side immediately. The boy was struggling, his small face pale and slick with sweat. Silas's own past came rushing back, a tidal wave of memory. The sight of Sarah, her breath growing shallow, the terrifying helplessness of watching a life slip away. He felt a tremor go through him, a jolt of old, familiar fear. But this time was different. This time he would not be helpless. He would not fail. "There's a plant," he said, his voice urgent. "Mullein. It grows by the creek. The leaves. They can open the airways." Alara looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "The creek is half a mile away. You'll never make it in this." "I know the way," he said, his jaw set. "Keep the steam going. Don't let him get cold." He turned and left without another word, disappearing into the swirling vortex of the storm. Alara watched him go, her heart in her throat. She had placed her son's life in the hands of this silent, grieving man. All she could do now was wait and pray. An hour passed, then two. Each moment was an eternity, measured in the rasp of her son's breathing. She held Samuel, rocking him, singing to him, willing her own strength into his small, failing body. The other children were huddled together by the fire, their faces pale with worry. Just when she thought all hope was lost, the cabin door burst open in a flurry of snow. Silas stumbled in, covered from head to toe in ice and snow, his face raw from the wind. In his frostbitten hand, he clutched a small bunch of grayish-green leaves. He was exhausted, shivering violently, but his eyes were clear and determined. He didn't stop to rest. He went straight to the stove, crushing the mullein leaves and steeping them in hot water, creating a pungent, earthy tea. He helped Alara coax the warm liquid, drop by drop, into Samuel's mouth. They worked together through the long night, a silent, unified team. He held the boy up while she administered the tea. She wiped the boy's brow while he kept the fire fed. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than any words. Slowly, miraculously, toward dawn, Samuel's breathing began to ease. The whistling rasp subsided into a clearer, deeper rhythm. The fever broke. He fell into a peaceful, healing sleep. Exhausted, Alara looked across the sleeping child at Silas. He was slumped in a chair by the fire, his head in his hands, his weary shoulders shaking with what looked like a silent sob. In the pale morning light filtering through the window, she saw him not as a stranger or a benefactor, but as a man who had faced down his own demons in a blizzard to save her child. She went to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, then slowly looked up. His eyes were raw with suppressed emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He just nodded, unable to speak, and for the first time, he did not pull away from her touch. He endured it. The storm passed, leaving a world of pristine, sculpted white. The sun returned, brilliant on the snow, and inside the cabin, The atmosphere had undergone a profound and permanent change. The crisis had shattered the last of the barriers between them. Silas no longer slept in the barn. He had moved a cot to the corner of the cabin. Near the door, a silent guardian who belonged inside the walls, not outside them. He took his meals at the table with the family. The first time he sat down, the children watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. Alara placed a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of him, and he ate, the simple act of sharing a meal feeling momentous, almost sacred. He began to talk more, his words still few and carefully chosen, but no longer strained. He told Caleb stories of the land, of tracking animals and reading the signs of the weather. He showed Martha how to whittle a piece of wood into the shape of a dog. He let Leah braid a small piece of twine into his hair, a gesture of childish affection that he tolerated with a quiet, unreadable expression. He was becoming a part of their lives, and they were becoming a part of his. The silence that remained was no longer one of distance and grief, but of comfort and understanding. They could sit together by the fire in the evenings, the children sleeping soundly, and not feel the need to fill the space with noise. It was a shared quiet, peaceful and deep, but the world outside the homestead had not forgotten them. As the snow melted and the roads became passable again, the need for supplies became urgent. Their flour was nearly gone, as was their salt and coffee. There was no avoiding a trip to town. Silas knew what it would mean. He knew the looks they would get, the whispers that would follow them. The town of Redemption was a small place, with long memories and sharp tongues. He had been a recluse for so long that his reemergence with a ready-made family would be a source of endless gossip. He tried to protect them. "I can go alone," he told Alara one morning. She looked up from her mending, her gaze steady. "We are out of thread, and Caleb needs new boots. We will go together." Her tone was quiet but firm. She would not hide. She had faced down starvation, widowhood, and a blizzard. She would not be cowed by the gossip of small-minded people. Her dignity was her armor, and she would not set it aside. The trip to town was tense. Silas drove the wagon, Alara beside him on the seat, the children bundled in the back. He could feel her rigidity, the way she held her head high, daring anyone to challenge her. As they drove down the main street, heads turned. Windows parted. The whispers started before they had even stopped the wagon. He tied the reins in front of the general store, his movements stiff. He could feel the weight of every stare. He helped Alara down, then the children, forming a protective circle around them as they entered the store. The storekeeper, a man named Peters, gave them a curt nod, his eyes lingering on Alara and the children with open curiosity. As Alara began to quietly gather her supplies, another man entered the store. It was Marcus Henderson, a broad-shouldered, wealthy land baron who had been trying to buy Silas's land for years. He saw Silas's homestead as a blight, an obstacle to his own expanding empire. Henderson looked from Silas to Alara, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, Silas," Henderson boomed, his voice filling the store. "Finally decided to come back to the living. And look what you dragged home with you." He gestured dismissively at Alara and the children. "A stray with her whole litter. Must have gotten her cheap. Did you pay by the head?" The air in the store went cold. A few of the other customers snickered. Alara froze, her hand hovering over a bolt of cloth. She lowered her gaze, a flush of deep, painful humiliation rising in her cheeks. The children huddled closer to her, sensing the threat. She did not defend herself. She simply endured the blow, her silence a shield of quiet dignity. But something inside Silas, something that had been dormant for 5 long years, finally broke. The cold grief was burned away by a sudden, hot surge of protective fury. He stepped forward, placing himself between Henderson and his family. He was not a large man, but at that moment, he seemed to fill the entire store, his presence massive and immovable. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. "She's with me," Henderson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "With you? You bought her, Silas. Don't pretend otherwise. Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, locked onto Henderson's. He took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked at Alara, at the shame and pain in her face, and then he looked back at the crowd that had gathered, his gaze sweeping over each one of them. He was making a public declaration, a vow. Not bought, he said, his voice clear and resonant. Chosen. The crowd fell silent. The word hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. It was a claim, a statement of intent. It was everything. Henderson's smirk faltered. He had expected the broken, silent man he'd always known. He was not prepared for this quiet, solid wall of defiance. He grumbled something under his breath and pushed his way out of the store. The tension broke. Alara looked up at Silas, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He had defended her. He had defended them. In front of everyone, he had called them his. She cries. He stays. The ride back to the homestead was as quiet as the ride into town, but the quality of the silence had changed entirely. It was no longer fraught with tension or uncertainty. It was filled with the reverberations of what had happened in the store, a shared experience that had bound them together in a new and profound way. Alara kept stealing glances at Silas's profile as he drove. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, but she could see a subtle softening around his eyes. He had acted against his nature, against 5 years of reclusive silence, and the effort had cost him something. But it had also given him something back. She could see it in the set of his weary shoulders, which seemed somehow less burdened than before. When they arrived home, the children, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, scrambled out of the wagon and ran into the cabin, their voices lighter than they had been all day. Silas and Alara were left alone to unload the supplies. They worked together, passing sacks of flour and sugar from the wagon to the porch, their movements synchronized, their hands occasionally brushing. Each touch was a small spark in the quiet air. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch steps. The vast, dark sky was littered with stars, and a gentle breeze whispered through the dry grass. The world felt peaceful, settled. It was Alara who finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. "No one has ever stood up for me like that," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Not since Thomas. Silas didn't respond immediately. He picked up a small twig and began to strip the bark with his thumbnail, his movements deliberate. "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't right." She was silent for a moment, gathering her courage. She needed him to understand. She needed to confess the truth of her past, to lay her own burdens down in this new, safe space he had created. "When my husband died," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we were left with nothing. I took what little money we had and bought passage on the stagecoach. I answered an advertisement for a housekeeper for a family in Oakhaven. Elite. I said I was a widow with 1 child." She took a shaky breath. "I was desperate. I thought if I could just get there, I could prove my worth. But when they saw all of us, they turned us away. The stagecoach driver, he felt sorry for me. He knew about your letter to the agency. He brought me here instead. He thought you might have a kinder heart." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I never meant to deceive you, Silas. I was just trying to survive." He listened to her story without interruption, his expression unreadable in the deepening dusk. The tale of her desperation and quiet strength resonated with his own concealed pain. When she was finished, he stopped fiddling with the twig and tossed it into the dust. He remained silent. Then he lifted his head and pointed a weathered finger toward a small, gentle rise on a hill overlooking the cabin, where a single gnarled oak tree stood against the sky. "There's a grave up there," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress. "2 really, but only 1 stone. My Sarah." The fever took her fast. The boy, he was born too soon. He never drew a breath. He swallowed hard, the confession costing him dearly. "I buried them myself, right there. I haven't spoken their names aloud since. It was a trade of truths. an exchange of old wounds on a quiet porch under a canopy of stars. He had told her of his loss, the source of the great cold silence that had defined him for so long. He had made himself vulnerable to her, just as she had to him. Her hand, tentatively, reached out and touched his arm. It was a simple, profound gesture. A current of warmth, of shared understanding and forgiveness, passed between them. He did not pull away. He let her touch rest there, a small anchor in the vast sea of his grief. They were no longer alone. From that night on, the homestead began to transform. The unspoken grief that had saturated the very soil of the place began to recede, replaced by the steady, quiet work of building a future. It was a home now in every sense of the word. Silas started to repair the old porch swing that had hung, broken and forgotten, since Sarah's time. He worked on it in the evenings, the scrape of his knife on the wood a peaceful, domestic sound. The children would watch him, offering their unsolicited and often unhelpful advice, and he would listen with a patience he never knew he possessed. He was carving a new rocker for Alara, a surprise. He worked on it in the barn, wanting the gift to be perfect. The place was no longer just his shelter. It was his workshop, a place of creation. Winter finally relinquished its grip, and a pale green blush appeared on the plains. Together, they plowed the small garden patch, turning over the dark, rich soil. Alara had a knowledge of plants that amazed him, a skill passed down from her mother. She knew which herbs could be used for medicine, which vegetables would thrive in the harsh climate. She planted with a hopeful determination that seemed to coax life from the reluctant earth. The children helped, their hands covered in dirt, their faces smudged and happy. They were putting down roots, both literally and figuratively. The laughter of the children became a common sound, no longer quickly swallowed by the wind but allowed to linger in the warm spring air. Samuel, fully recovered, was a whirlwind of energy. Martha, once so quiet and watchful, now chattered away to the chickens. Leah followed Silas everywhere, her small hand often finding its way into his large, calloused one. Caleb had become his right hand, a strong and reliable apprentice who absorbed every lesson about the land and its rhythms. He was no longer just the silent man who had saved them. He was becoming their father. One afternoon, as they were mending a fence at the far end of the property, Caleb looked up at Silas, his young face serious. "Mr. Henderson," he said, "will he be back?" Silas drove a fence post into the ground with a solid thud before he answered. He looked out over the land, which now held not just his past, but his future. "He might," Silas said, his voice calm, "but this is our home. We protect our home." He said the word "we" without thinking, the pronoun feeling as natural and solid as the earth beneath his feet. They were a unit, a family forged in hardship and silence. They were strong together. The romantic fulfillment between Silas and Alara was not a sudden fire, but a slow, growing warmth, like the steady heat from a well-tended stove. It was in the shared glances over the dinner table, the way she mended his shirt without being asked, the way he brought her a cluster of early wildflowers he'd found by the creek. It was a love built not on grand declarations, but on 1,000 small, reliable acts of care. One evening, Alara came out to the porch where he was sitting, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed one to him, and their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping the hot coffee, watching the colors fade from the sky. "I used to hate the sunsets," he said, his voice a low rumble. It just meant another night was coming. Another long, quiet night. He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and full of an emotion she was no longer afraid to see. "I don't hate them anymore. The nights are not so quiet now," she said with a small, gentle smile. He reached out and took her free hand, his grip firm and warm. "No," he said. "They're not." They realized, in that quiet moment, that they were no longer just survivors sharing a roof. They were partners, building a life from the dust and silence. They were strong together, and that was more than enough. The seasons turned. Summer brought a surprising bounty from their small garden. Autumn painted the plains in shades of gold and russet. The homestead thrived. The cabin felt larger, filled with warmth and life. Winter returned, but this time it was not a threat. It was a season of quiet consolidation, a time for stories by the fire and the mending of tools for the spring to come. The cabin was a bastion of warmth and light against the cold, a testament to the family that now lived within its walls. The children were growing, their thin limbs filling out, the haunted look in their eyes replaced by the easy confidence of those who know they are safe and loved. Silas had finished the rocker he'd been carving for Ilara. He brought it into the cabin one evening, the wood smooth and glowing in the lamplight. It was a beautiful piece of work, simple and sturdy, made with a craftsman's care. He set it by the fire, in the exact spot where she liked to sit and do her mending. She ran her hand over the curved back, her eyes shining. She didn't need to say anything. Her look of grateful wonder was thanks enough. He had become a fixture in their lives, a solid, reliable presence they all orbited around. He taught Caleb how to shoot, his hands steady on the boy's shoulders as he helped him aim. He read to the younger children from the one book he owned, an old copy of Shakespeare, his deep voice giving a strange, earthy gravity to the unfamiliar words. He was a father. He was a husband. He had found his purpose not in forgetting his past, but in building a new present. The grave on the hill was still there, a quiet reminder of what he had lost. But it was no longer a place of raw, unending grief. One clear, cold afternoon, he asked Ilara to walk up there with him. The children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, stayed behind. They stood before the simple wooden cross, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. He reached out and tucked them gently behind her ear. "This is Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And our son. I think she would have liked you." Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, her arm sliding around his waist. "I think Thomas would have been grateful to you," she replied, "for taking care of us." They stood there for a long time, two living souls paying their respects to the ghosts of the past, their shared warmth a defiant stand against the cold memory of loss. They were not replacing what they had lost. They were honoring it by choosing to live again, to love again. They were a testament to the resilience of the human heart. Their homestead, once a place of isolation and sorrow, had become a beacon. Travelers caught in a sudden storm would sometimes see the light from their window and be guided to safety, always to be met with a warm meal and a safe place to rest. No questions asked. The story of the silent rancher and the widow with 5 children became a quiet legend in the territory, a tale of unexpected kindness and second chances. The narrator speaks directly. Love grows where no one looks, in the cracks of broken hearts and the silence between two lonely souls. It is a hardy plant, thriving not in gentle sunlight, but in the harsh, wind-swept plains of shared hardship. It asks for nothing but a small patch of earth to grow in, and a little bit of steady, quiet care. Silas had spent his last dollar on a mail-order bride, a desperate bid to buy companionship. Instead, he had been given something far more valuable. He had been given a family. He had been given a reason to face the sunrise again. He had been given a home. As winter deepened, their life took on a comfortable, enduring rhythm. The days were short, the nights long, but the cabin was always filled with light. They had become a single entity, a family woven together with threads of mutual respect, quiet affection, and the shared memory of survival. Their happily ever after was not a grand affair. It was written in the daily ledger of small moments. A shared smile, a warm blanket, a child's peaceful sleep. It was a quiet, dignified, and deeply honest happiness. It was enough. It was everything. The final symbol of their new life was the window. The old one had been small, its glass warped and cloudy, letting in only a sliver of the vast sky. It was a window designed for a man who did not want to see the world. One day, Silas began to work on it. With Caleb's help, he carefully removed the old frame and began to construct a new, larger one. It was a slow, deliberate process. He wanted it to be perfect. He wanted to let the light in, Alara watched him work, a quiet understanding passing between them. He wasn't just building a window. He was tearing down the last wall around his heart. When it was finished, the new window transformed the small cabin. Light flooded the room, illuminating the worn wooden floors and the simple, sturdy furniture. It framed the vast expanse of the plains not as a threat, but as a promise. It was an open eye looking out onto their future. An open window. That evening, as they all sat in the newly brightened room, Silas looked at Alara, who was sitting in the rocker he had made for her, the baby asleep in her arms. The firelight played on her face, softening the lines of exhaustion into lines of peace. He felt a sense of rightness so profound it almost took his breath away. This was his life now. This was his family. He went to her side and crouched down, his large frame seeming to fold around her and the child. He gently touched the baby's cheek, his finger rough against the perfect softness of the skin. He looked up at Alara, his heart in his eyes. He didn't need to say the words. She could read them in his gaze. But he said them anyway, his voice low and certain, a vow made not in a church, but in the quiet sanctuary of their home. "Stay here." She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken contract. It was a kiss of gratitude, of partnership, of a deep and abiding love that had grown in the most unlikely of places. "Always," she whispered back. The carved rocker creaked softly. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but inside the small cabin, there was only the sound of a family, breathing together in the warm, safe dark. He didn't know it when she first stepped off that wagon, a portrait of exhaustion and quiet desperation, but his first true home was right in front of him. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their story was not one of grand passion or heroic deeds. It was a quieter, more profound tale, a story about the dignity of the survivor, the redemptive power of kindness, and the extraordinary courage it takes to open a shuttered heart to the light. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the ones we seek, but the ones that find us when we are lost, showing us the way back not to where we were, but to where we were always meant to be. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that even in the most desolate of landscapes, life can take root. Remember that silence can speak volumes, and that the smallest gesture of care can be the foundation upon which a new world is built. Let it be a quiet strength in your own heart, a reminder that redemption is always possible, and that home is not a place, but a choice you make with the people you choose to love. We'll see you again, where silence means home. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most.